Something is trying to get your attention tonight. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet precision that feels almost impossible to ignore. You may notice it in the way your mind keeps circling back to the same thought, or in the strange feeling that a realization is forming just beneath the surface, like a sentence you're about to remember but haven't quite reached yet. That's not random. Right now, Mercury is moving directly into the heart of the Sun. A rare moment known as Mercury Kazimi, when the planet of thought, communication, and perception sits exactly in the center of the Sun's light. For a brief window, the noise clears. And when that happens, something unusual occurs inside your mind. Clarity doesn't arrive gradually. It lands all at once, almost like someone quietly placing a piece of truth on the table in front of you. And if you've been the one who usually holds everything together, the one people rely on to stay calm, stay rational, stay steady, then this moment tends to hit you differently. Because you're used to solving problems. But this isn't a problem. It's a message. And the strange part is, it may already be arriving. Not as some dramatic cosmic sign, but as a realization that feels oddly familiar, like something you've known for a long time, but kept setting aside because it wasn't convenient to face yet. Kazimi moments do that. They pull thoughts out of the shadows. They illuminate patterns you've been living inside without fully noticing. And the timing is rarely comfortable, because this alignment doesn't just reveal information. It reveals truth. The kind that doesn't argue with you. The kind that simply sits there quietly and waits for you to acknowledge it. And tonight, something in your life is about to become very difficult to ignore. Maybe it's a relationship dynamic that suddenly makes more sense than it did yesterday. Maybe it's a decision you've been delaying, hoping the answer would eventually become obvious. Or maybe it's a subtle realization about yourself, about what you've tolerated, what you've outgrown, or what you're finally ready to change. Clarity rarely feels explosive in the moment. Most of the time, it feels simple, almost too simple. And that's why so many people miss it. Because they're waiting for a dramatic signal, a loud confirmation, a sign that's impossible to misunderstand. But the truth is, most people don't miss the message. They dismiss it. The mind is very good at that, especially when the realization threatens to disrupt a familiar pattern. You might notice it as a quiet thought that appears for a moment and then immediately gets pushed aside. Something like, that situation isn't actually good for me anymore. Or, I already know what I need to do. But instead of sitting with that thought, most people rationalize it away. They convince themselves they're overthinking, or that they're just being emotional, or that the timing isn't right. And slowly, the clarity fades back into background noise. But Kazimi moments don't arrive to be convenient. They arrive to cut through fog. Mercury sitting inside the Sun acts like a spotlight on the mind itself. Suddenly the patterns are visible. The excuses stop sounding convincing. And the realization you've been avoiding starts to feel undeniable. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply becomes clear. And if you're someone who tends to absorb a lot, other people's emotions, expectations, responsibilities, then this kind of clarity can feel strangely relieving. Because it gives you something rare. Permission to see things exactly as they are. Not as they were. Not as you hoped they might become. But as they exist right now. And that kind of honesty can change everything. Not immediately, but quietly. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. And tonight, the universe isn't forcing anything dramatic to happen. It's doing something far more precise. It's handing you a moment of truth. The question isn't whether the message will appear. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it does. Because the next part of this alignment is where things start to get strange. And it usually begins in the most ordinary moment imaginable. Most people think the hardest part of receiving clarity is recognizing it. It isn't. The hardest part is believing it. Because when a realization finally appears, clear, simple, almost obvious, the mind immediately tries to negotiate with it. You might notice the thought arrive quietly. Something small but precise. Maybe suddenly see a pattern in a relationship that never quite made sense before. Maybe a decision you've been delaying suddenly feels settled, even though nothing outside has changed. For a moment, everything lines up. And then the doubt begins. The mind asks questions it never asked before. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm reacting too quickly? What if I should wait a little longer? But here's what's interesting about moments like this. Real clarity rarely feels dramatic. It feels calm, almost plain. It doesn't come with fireworks or emotional intensity. It arrives as a quiet understanding that doesn't need to argue with you. And that simplicity is exactly why people dismiss it. They expect truth to feel bigger than it actually does. So when the realization shows up as a single calm thought, something like, "This situation isn't aligned with me anymore," the mind assumes it must be incomplete. But during a Mercury Kazimi, the opposite is happening. The usual mental fog lifts for a moment. The part of you that constantly analyzes, replays conversations, and searches for hidden meanings goes quiet. And in that brief silence, something very direct becomes visible. You see the pattern. You see the answer. And you see the next step. Not emotionally. Clearly. The mistake most people make is assuming clarity needs more evidence. So they start collecting opinions. They ask friends for advice. They replay the situation again and again in their mind, hoping to confirm what they already know. But clarity doesn't improve through overanalysis. It fades. Because the longer you debate a truth you already recognize, the easier it becomes to talk yourself out of it. Especially if you've spent years being the dependable one. The one who adjusts. The one who gives people the benefit of the doubt. The one who holds everything together even when it's exhausting. People like that are very good at ignoring their own realizations. They call it patience. They call it maturity. But sometimes it's simply hesitation. And Mercury Kazimi has a strange way of exposing that hesitation. Not by forcing a decision, but by making the truth so simple that avoiding it suddenly feels harder than accepting it. That's the moment where something shifts inside you. Quietly. Because once clarity appears, your mind starts paying attention to things it previously overlooked. A tone in someone's voice. A pattern in their behavior. A small detail that suddenly confirms what you've been sensing for a long time. And this is where the universe tends to deliver the message in the most unexpected way. Not through some dramatic sign in the sky, but through something incredibly ordinary. A sentence. A lyric. A conversation you almost didn't have. And somehow it says exactly what you needed to hear. The message rarely arrives in the way people expect. No flashing sign. No dramatic moment where everything suddenly stops. Most of the time, it slips into your life disguised as something ordinary. A short conversation you almost ignored. A random sentence someone says without realizing its weight. A lyric playing in the background while your mind is somewhere else. And suddenly something inside you pauses. Not because the moment itself was extraordinary, but because the timing was perfect. Mercury governs communication, the subtle mechanics of how information moves through your life. Conversations, texts, timing, words that appear at exactly the right moment. During a Kazimi, those channels sharpen. Things start lining up with strange precision. You might notice someone bringing up a topic you were just thinking about earlier that day. Or a casual comment from a coworker that somehow describes the exact situation you've been quietly wrestling with. And the interesting part is the other person usually has no idea. They just delivered a message that mattered to you. To them, it was just a sentence. To you, it lands differently. Because when clarity is forming in your mind, the world around you starts reflecting pieces of that realization back to you. It's subtle, almost easy to overlook. But if you're the kind of person who tends to observe more than you speak, the quiet one who notices patterns in people's behavior, tone, and timing, you'll recognize it immediately. Something in the moment feels aligned, not mystical, precise. You hear the sentence and think, that's exactly what I was trying to understand. And just like that, the missing piece appears. The strange thing about these moments is that they rarely arrive when you're actively searching for them. They show up when your guard is down, while you're scrolling your phone, walking through a store, half listening to someone talk. And then suddenly a single phrase catches your attention, and everything in your mind goes still. For a second, you realize something. Something you weren't fully ready to admit before. That's the way Mercury Kazimi tends to work. It doesn't force answers. It places them quietly in your path. But here's where the experience becomes even stranger. Because right before that clarity locks into place, your mind may start behaving a little differently. Small mental glitches begin appearing. Things you normally never do. Right before a breakthrough, the mind often behaves in strange ways. Not dramatic enough to worry you, just slightly off. You might walk into a room and forget why you went there. Lose your train of thought in the middle of a sentence. Misplace something you were holding seconds ago. Normally, you would brush it off as distraction. But during moments like this, it tends to happen more than usual. And that's not because your mind is failing. It's because it's reorganizing. When Mercury moves into the heart of the Sun, the part of the mind that constantly analyzes information starts processing things at a deeper level. Old conclusions get re-examined. Assumptions quietly shift. Connections between events suddenly begin forming. And while that internal recalibration is happening, the surface level of your thinking can feel temporarily scrambled. Like a computer running a background update. Simple details slip through your fingers. You forget what you were about to say. You pause mid-conversation searching for a word that normally comes easily. It feels like a glitch, but it's actually a sign that your mind is clearing space. Because breakthroughs rarely appear while the mind is overloaded. They arrive when something finally pauses long enough for understanding to surface. You might notice yourself staring at something for a moment longer than usual, or drifting into thought during a routine task. Not distracted. Processing. The dependable ones, the people who are always thinking ahead, solving problems, anticipating what others need, experience this most strongly. Because their minds are almost always active, always calculating, always preparing. So when a moment of clarity begins forming, the brain slows down just enough to reorganize the pieces. And during that pause, those small glitches appear. Forgetting things, losing words, stopping mid-thought. It's temporary, but it creates an unusual opening. Because when the noise of constant thinking quiets for a moment, something else becomes easier to notice, where your attention naturally goes. And that matters more than most people realize. Because attention is direction. What you focus on doesn't just occupy your mind. It quietly shapes the path your life begins moving toward. Where your attention goes, your life quietly follows. Most people underestimate how powerful that is. They assume their direction is shaped by circumstances, opportunities, or the behavior of other people. But far more often, it's shaped by something simpler. What they keep thinking about. During moments like this, when the mind is unusually clear, that pattern becomes easier to see. You might suddenly notice how much of your mental space has been occupied by one specific worry, a situation you keep replaying, a person whose actions you keep trying to interpret. And once you notice it, something else becomes obvious. Your focus has been feeding it, not intentionally, but consistently. The mind works like a lens. Whatever it points at long enough begins to feel bigger, heavier, more important than everything else. That's why two people can live in the same environment and experience completely different lives. One trains their attention toward possibility. The other stays locked onto fear, disappointment, and worst-case scenarios. Both patterns grow. Mercury's alignment with the Sun brings a rare moment where you can see that mechanism clearly. You recognize what your mind has been amplifying, and more importantly, what it could amplify instead. This isn't about pretending everything is positive. You're too perceptive for that kind of denial. It's about something quieter, choosing what deserves your focus. The quiet observer usually understands this faster than most people, because they notice how conversations shift depending on where attention is placed, how people who constantly expect conflict tend to find it, how those who expect opportunity seem to stumble into it more often. Focus creates direction. Not instantly, but steadily. And tonight, there's a subtle invitation inside this alignment. A chance to redirect the lens, away from the thoughts that keep you stuck in the same mental loop and toward the ones that actually move your life forward. Because once your attention shifts, something interesting tends to follow. Memories start resurfacing. Moments from the past you hadn't thought about in years. Not randomly, but with a kind of meaning that suddenly feels impossible to ignore. Sometimes the mind reaches backward before it moves forward. You might notice that tonight, a memory appearing out of nowhere, an old conversation replaying in your head while you're doing something completely unrelated. Maybe it's a moment you haven't thought about in years, a decision you made quickly, a relationship dynamic you once tried to understand but eventually stopped questioning. And suddenly it's back. Not emotionally overwhelming, just clear. That's one of the quieter effects of this alignment moving through Pisces energy. The mind becomes less focused on analysis and more open to meaning. Memories surface not to trap you in the past, but to show you something you couldn't see when you originally lived through it. Perspective changes everything. At the time, you were inside the situation, trying to manage it, trying to make sense of other people's behavior while still protecting the stability of your life. Now you're outside it, and that distance reveals patterns that were invisible before. You might suddenly understand why someone behaved the way they did, or realize that a moment you once blamed yourself for actually had nothing to do with you. That kind of clarity can feel strangely peaceful, because when the mind finally understands something, it stops replaying it. The quiet observer often experiences this more deeply than others, not because they dwell on the past, but because they store details most people overlook. Small tones in someone's voice, subtle shifts in behavior, moments that felt insignificant at the time but never fully left your memory. Tonight, those fragments may begin connecting. A conversation from years ago suddenly explains a pattern you're seeing now. A choice you once questioned suddenly makes perfect sense. It's like looking at a puzzle piece you've been carrying for a long time and finally seeing where it belongs. And once those connections start forming, something else happens. Your mind stops trying to force logical explanations, because the understanding you receive doesn't arrive through analysis. It arrives through something much quieter. Intuition. A kind of knowing that doesn't need to prove itself. There's a difference between thinking about something and knowing it. Most of the time, the mind prefers thinking. It analyzes. It compares possibilities. It runs through scenarios over and over, hoping the extra effort will eventually produce certainty. But tonight, that process may start to feel strangely unnecessary, because instead of building answers step by step, something inside you simply understands. That's the influence of this moment moving through Pisces energy. Mercury, the part of the mind that normally operates through logic and explanation, shifts into a quieter mode of perception. The answers don't arrive as arguments. They arrive as recognition. You might notice it in the way a question that has followed you for months suddenly loses its complexity. The situation hasn't changed, but the confusion around it disappears. You stop trying to solve it, because you see it. And once you see something clearly, the urge to overthink fades. For someone who usually carries the responsibility of being the rational one, the dependable thinker, the person others expect to stay grounded, this kind of understanding can feel unfamiliar at first. You're used to earning clarity through effort, through research, through careful conversations, through patiently gathering enough information to justify a decision. But intuitive understanding works differently. It doesn't build evidence. It reveals alignment. You feel the difference between something that fits your life and something that only stayed there out of habit. And when that recognition arrives, it's surprisingly calm. No dramatic emotional wave, just a quiet internal shift that says, "Now I understand." This is the moment many people start second-guessing themselves, because intuition doesn't look as convincing as logic. There's no list of reasons. No detailed explanation, just a clear internal signal that something is right or something is finished. And here's the truth most people discover later. The moments they trusted that quiet signal are the ones that changed their direction the most. Because intuition doesn't shout to compete with your thoughts. It waits for the moment when your thoughts finally become quiet enough to hear it. And tonight, that quiet understanding may be preparing you for the final part of this alignment. The real gift hidden inside it, a rare reset for the mind itself. By the time this alignment reaches its peak, something inside your mind feels lighter. Not because every problem in your life has suddenly disappeared, but because the confusion around one important area has quietly dissolved. That's the strange gift of a Kazimi moment. Even in the middle of Mercury's usual chaos, the crossed wires, the misunderstandings, the constant mental noise, there's a brief window where everything aligns. Thoughts sharpen, distractions fade, and the truth becomes visible in a way that feels almost effortless. You might suddenly realize what you actually want from a situation you've been tolerating for too long, or recognize that a path you once believed was necessary no longer fits the person you've become. Not dramatically, just clearly. And clarity has a quiet power, because once the mind stops fighting itself, your next step becomes easier to recognize. You don't need 10 different opinions. You don't need another week of overthinking. You simply know what direction feels honest now. For someone who has spent a long time being the dependable one, the one who keeps adjusting, keeps giving people the benefit of the doubt, keeps carrying responsibilities without complaint, that realization can feel like a reset, not a rebellion. Precision. You begin noticing where your attention belongs and where it no longer does. Which conversations deserve your time. Which expectations you've quietly outgrown. Which parts of your life are ready to move forward. And the interesting thing is, the outside world may not immediately see this shift. From the surface, nothing dramatic changes. You still speak calmly. You still move through your day the same way. But internally, the fog has lifted. You're no longer questioning the same things. You're no longer trying to solve the same emotional puzzles. You've simply refined your direction. That's what this alignment offers. Not a sudden transformation. A mental reset. A moment where doubt loosens its grip just long enough for clarity to take its place. And if you've been paying attention tonight, you may have already felt the beginning of that shift. A realization. A memory connecting. A thought that suddenly feels settled. If that happened for you, take it seriously. Not urgently, just honestly. Because moments like this tend to appear quietly and shape your next chapter long before anyone else notices the change. If you felt that moment of clarity tonight, write clear in the comments. Not for anyone else. Just as a small acknowledgement that you recognize the message when it arrived. Tonight isn't about spectacle. It's about precision. A subtle shift that quietly changes how you move through your life, how you perceive your choices, and how you allow yourself to see the truth. You may not feel it immediately in the world around you. That's not the point. The point is inside you. A recalibration of your mind, a gentle clearing of doubt, a rare alignment with clarity. If you've been the one who overgives, who absorbs too much, or who silently carries responsibility for others, this moment is your invitation to pause, notice, and honor the quiet understanding that has arrived. Remember, Mercury Kazimi doesn't shout. It doesn't force revelations with drama. It offers them in a whisper. And the people who listen closely are the ones who notice how quickly their path shifts afterward. So take a deep breath. Trust the insight. Let the ordinary moments speak for themselves. And allow your attention to fall where it truly matters. If this message landed for you, if something inside finally feels aligned, comment refined below. Not to show anyone else, but as a way to acknowledge that you've received the clarity you've been waiting for, and that you're ready to move forward with it.